So yes, thank you for the introduction. So kind of as explained, so what we talk about today is some of the research that we're conducting on county lines, particularly looking at how the police delineate between people who may be vulnerable, people who may be offenders and people who may be victims within the context of county lines in the UK. So I guess a good place to start would be to kind of define what county lines are. So it's three main facets around the characteristics of county lines. So first of all, you need to have a telephone in order to mediate communication between different areas of the networks. There needs to be the transportation of drugs, and fundamentally, which is why we're researching it, is the issue of exploitation. So exploitation is fundamental to kind of the function of the methodology of county lines. And to give you a sense of what this exploitation may look like, it usually comes in three main forms. So first of all is cookering. That's where a vulnerable person may have their property taken over by a drugs gang, and that property is used kind of as a location to distribute or sell drugs from. Secondly, you have user dealers, and these can be people who are being given free drugs or being drug users who are being exploited into working for the drugs gangs. And finally, what we're looking at in quite a lot of detail in our research is the exploitation of young people. And this is one of the main elements, which is why county lines have become such a prevalent issue within policing, within public discourse over recent years. So as and when county lines emerged, it's very much kind of hotly debated. It's not really something we're going to be getting into a huge amount of detail today. But to give you a sense about how these things have expanded in recent years. So on the left-hand side is from an article that was written in 2012, from the Home Office in 2012, which suggests that county lines was initially kind of quite London-centric, and then it had almost spokes of a wheel. These networks would set up operations in areas in and around London. And then what we see towards the end of the last decade is that county lines have kind of permeated into every area of the UK, into every police force in the UK. And what our research is showing us from our interviews with senior police officers is actually that county lines operations are now probably prevalent in every town and city in the UK. So we've seen a massive expansion of a methodology which uses exploitation as a key facet of their business operations, which is of course incredibly problematic. And whilst these drug gangs operate across wide areas, one of the problems we're seeing, or what kind of very obvious problem, is that the UK police force is incredibly fragmented. So whereas lots of countries may have state police or national police, what we have in the UK is 44 different territorial forces, all of which work in subtly different ways, all of which have slightly different approaches towards safeguarding, towards dealing with offenders. So this creates a patchwork of slightly different approaches to combating county lines, which can in some circumstances be somewhat problematic in terms of the kind of replication of best practice. Okay, so that's the background. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about kind of the research that myself and colleagues at the centre have been doing. So it comes in three phases. So the first phase, which is almost complete, is where we interview senior police officers from 45 forces. So that's 44 territorial forces and the British Transport Police, to understand basically what the presence of county lines is in their area, and kind of explore the way in which they're policing county lines first of all, and also the way in which they're trying to support vulnerable people, and actually how they try to understand the issues around exploitation. Second phase is where us as a research team, we've gone out to 3 different areas in the UK where we have gone out to interview people with lived experience to understand their perspectives and their experiences of being involved in county lines. Also charities, NGOs who have been supporting these young people and older people in some circumstances, and also frontline police officers to understand. So first of all, from phase 1, we understand what's going on at a high level, but we want to understand how that actually plays out on the ground by the frontline police officers. And then phase 3 is where we'll be working with hopefully be working with some police forces to kind of implement some of the best findings from our research. So a lot of work going on in this project. So in recent years, what we've seen is there's been a characterisation of young people who have been involved in county lines as victims. So this is a poster that was produced in 2017 by the National Crime Agency, which clearly presents this person, Dan, as a victim of county lines. So very clear kind of visual representation of criminality, of someone being a victim. You probably can't see this one too well, but this is produced by Essex Police, and it's basically showing like a young person being a drugs mule, and it's kind of and someone being a puppet on a string, which is problematic in many ways, but you get the idea. And this is a photo that I took actually just in York train station just before Christmas to kind of highlight the issues around county lines and telling people who get onto trains to be looking out for these types of things. Okay, so one of the things I wanted to do, particularly around the theme of the discussion today, I wanted to talk about the lives of people who are involved in this. I want to talk about one young man in particular who I interviewed last summer back in July. So, won't be giving his name obviously, but this is a young man who he first got involved in county lines when he was 14 years old. So he was living with his father. His father was a drug user, and some drugs gangs came over and they cuckooed his property. So they were using his property to sell drugs out of when he was 14 years old. So subsequently, he got involved in the county lines gang. He was given £100 per day to move drugs around his neighbourhood at 14 years old, which is incredibly concerning. So, and then at that point, he stopped going to school on a regular basis. So 14 years old, being involved in a drugs gang, transporting drugs around his neighbourhoods. So he did that for a couple of years, and then once he got to age 16, the situation started to escalate quite significantly. So he was ordered to take drugs from where he was living to another city 2 hours away. He was given a bag, and he was told, do not look in this bag under any circumstances. Curiosity got the better of him because he's a 16-year-old boy. He looked in the bag and he found wraps of crack, wraps of heroin, ammunition, and £50,000. The drugs gangs found out that he had looked in the bag, and they told him that he had to work for them until he forgot what he had seen, which clearly wasn't going to be happening. So the situation escalated further, and then within his town or city, he was working for the drugs gangs on a daily basis, transporting drugs around to a value of about £2,000 per day. So that's a 16-year-old who's been involved in county lines for 2 years and is now transporting drugs around his area. So quite deep involvement in county lines at such a young age. That's on the next slide. So when he reached the age of 17, things started to escalate even further. So from that point, he was sent to all corners of the UK to sell drugs out of cuckoo properties. He was told that if he tried to leave county lines or leave the gang, his family would be in danger and he would be in great danger. He even saw one of his friends being shot in the head. So we're talking a very, very traumatic event for a 17-year-old boy. On one day, he was actually stabbed in a cuckoo property when people tried to take it over. At which point he thought he was going to end his own. He thought his life was going to end. Now, fortunately, he recovered. His life's improved significantly. He is now in a good position. He's back at college, and his life is massively improved significantly. But this is because the police saw him as someone who's a victim rather than an offender. So a very, very clear differentiation between those two things. If he had been seen as someone who was an offender, then his circumstances and his outcome would have been very different. So, yes, whilst he's been through very difficult circumstances, his life is a lot better now. Towards the end of the interview, he said the words to me, I feel like a better person doing what I'm doing nowadays instead of being on a train selling drugs. So, things have improved massively. And the reason why his situation improved massively is because he was seen, as we would argue, as an ideal victim. So he was under the age of 18. He was a first-time offender, first time he was been arrested. He had a physical or mental disability or trauma. He had ADHD, and he was incredibly scared when he was arrested. So he was very clearly someone who was a victim as opposed to an offender. But that's not always the case. There are many people who are involved in county lines who are not seen as victims. And there's many, many reasons. So I'm just going to highlight some of them here. So race and ethnicity. These are quotes from police officers. from the first phase of our research. So race and ethnicity play a significant role, as does someone's imposing stature. So this police officer saying, a 15-year-old, 6'3" black kid who has significant amounts of controlled drugs on this person, how do we deal with that? So that's playing a role in whether or not someone's seen as a victim or an offender, which is quite problematic. Victims hiding their vulnerabilities. So many young men in particular won't necessarily want to be seen as a victim. They would rather be seen as someone who's got autonomy, someone who's got power over their own future. So that's clearly they'll be hiding their vulnerabilities to some regards. And also, unsurprisingly, people not wanting to engage with the police, which is kind of unsurprising. So people not wanting to engage with the police and then going back to the gangs that that they were working with in the first place, and some quite concerning ideas around victim-perpetrator relations at the bottom there. And being over the age of 18 is a very significant Rubicon as well. So once you're under the age of 18, we're getting the assumption from police officers. If you're under the age of 18, there's a high possibility that you could be a victim. Whereas if you go over the age of 18, then the chances are you'll probably be seen as an offender. So if you're over the age of 18 and you haven't got a lot of evidence to support the idea of victimhood, then you may end up being convicted, even if you are vulnerable. So what we're seeing as well is that there's a small number of police officers who see this as quite a problematic approach. I'm not saying this is from all police officers, but I would say probably from around half a dozen of the 45 that we've interviewed thus far are saying that by taking this approach towards safeguarding, by looking at these young people in particular as victims, what's happening essentially is that you are decriminalising drug dealing for people who are under the age of 18. And one of the things that we're also finding out as well is that we're kind of when I'm talking about kind of a Rubicon when you reach between the ages of 17 and 18. Another line that's crossed is when a vulnerable young person goes on to recruit and exploit other young people. At that point, what the police are starting to use the term alpha victims. So someone who may well be vulnerable themselves going on to exploit other people, that's seen as a crime, which basically means that they need to be seen as a perpetrator, as opposed to a victim, even if that person may be under duress to get the other person involved in county lines, so they may well be vulnerable themselves. So that gives you a kind of snapshot of what we're doing. But so in summary, what we're seeing is that young people in drug markets are being framed to a certain extent as victims rather than offenders. Age, as I mentioned, age is a very key contributor as to whether or not someone should be seen as someone who's vulnerable or whether or not someone's culpable. So age is a massive factor. And alpha victims, as I've just explained, are likely to be prosecuted even if they are vulnerable themselves. So this is just one project that we're doing at the Vulnerability and Policing Futures Research Centre. If you want to see more work that we're doing, just have a go to our website there or speak to myself or my colleagues who are sat in the middle over there, waving, Charlie. So in addition to county lines, we've also got research going on online child sexual victimisation, mental illness, domestic abuse, service provision, and we've also got a series of data science projects that look at the notion of vulnerability in many contexts. Okay, thank you.